In spite of all of M&R's efforts to mitigate climate change, it will still occur and it will have an impact on Ontario's natural resources. Our mitigation efforts may slow climate change and reduce its impacts, but they alone will not be enough to eliminate the change or circumvent its impacts. Under these circumstances, the Ministry of Natural Resources will have no choice but to adapt to the reality of climate change in a number of ways.
One of the challenges we face is that even if we were to stop the increase in CO2 production right now and just hold it stable, there's a lag effect that's going to continue to increase the temperature, that's going to continue to contribute to environmental variability over the next several decades. So there's nothing we can do about that. We have to be able to adapt. We have to be able to recognize that we have a problem.
There are a lot of things that we can do to mitigate and adapt to climate change. In order to do this, we need better science, we need better collaboration of information and data, we need better modeling. In order to do this, we need to have the I&IT structures in place to help manage and share the data and information. We need to be speaking with our partners and working with our partners to improve the science, to improve the modeling, to help cut back the uncertainty of what the impacts of climate change are going to be.
The types of tools we need to be able to manage forests in the future are going to be ones that entail an understanding of how forests respond to climate. So we have to understand better how forest succession takes place in relationship to temperature, precipitation, changed growing season lengths, available soil moisture. That's one example. So we need tools that are climatically sensitive. We have to discard the tools that we're used to using that are mainly empirically based on past performance of the forest. So what we need is process, mechanistic related tools that allow us to project how forests behave in future conditions.
As the Ministry of Natural Resources begins adapting to climate change, we must be aware that there are still many unknowns and some different opinions on the best way to proceed. The role of adaptive management is one area where there are differing views among M&R scientists at this time.
One of the most significant things that we can do in terms of adaptation is, and it's captured in the word, try to use an adaptive approach. We've really got to be keeping track right now of the way our resources change, the way they're responding to the weather fluctuations, the way they're responding to the longer term trends that are emerging, because our science has to keep up with the changing climate if we're going to predict the future wood supply or future resource availability.
I've been doing some thinking about the role of adaptive management in Ontario and forests, and I'm not sure that it's going to be an appropriate approach in the future, and here's why, and maybe I'm wrong. Applying an empirical treatment today and looking at how the forest reacts does not give us a good understanding of how the forest will react in a future climate.
And I think there's an opportunity then in a place like Quetico to really do your baseline homework now and establish what are the conditions and what are the communities and what are the relationships in the ecosystem now, and then use that as a base on which to better understand what those changes are over the next 50 and 100 years. It really is a great research opportunity waiting to happen.
Well, I think there's a number of things we can do. I think we have to make a concerted effort to take our science and translate it into a form that's readily and easily available and accessible for the average person. So that means we will have to work with the scientists in the ministry to produce educational materials that are available for people, not just children in schools, but for adults, for scientists, for people in everyday walks of life.
In the short term, we need to develop a better understanding of the changes that will happen to polar bear populations and how quickly they will happen. That will give us a better understanding of how quickly we need to work with our partner agencies in Quebec and Nunavut to control overall harvest from that southern Hudson Bay population.
So in terms of what we do to adapt is that we may need to change our regulations, for example, to protect the species that are at a disadvantage, to make sure that they still persist. We should consider publicizing the fact that there are new resources in some of these areas that weren't there before that should be used. For example, the largemouth bass become much more prevalent in the embayments of the Great Lakes.
M&R has a big role to play in adaptation to climate change just as much as we do in the mitigation of climate change. What we're thinking of and what some of the developers are thinking of is we'll probably need to consider storing water when it becomes available behind reservoirs more often. Another option that's being considered is what we call pumped storage of electricity, where you save water in a reservoir that's higher than your generator. You let the water run through the generator and recirculate it in a kind of a continuous motion. We haven't developed the technology to store wind energy. Unfortunately, right now we have to use the wind energy when the wind is blowing. But there has been some discussions about possibly storing wind energy as compressed air. So you would use the wind turbines to compress air. You store the compressed air in whatever reservoirs you can, and then you release the compressed air through turbines when you need the energy.
The fighting the fires, in particular with drought and storm damage, has meant a tremendous change in our standard operating procedures because the risks to our staff have accelerated exponentially. And so we've had to make a lot of changes in particular, crew goes to a fire, it's in storm damage, they got to cut their way in, they got to make sure they have an escape route now, they just can't try to make their way over the standing timber. You've got to have a individual of a senior fire technical skills overhead, ensuring the safety of those people until you know the forward spread of the fire is stopped. Those are all the kinds of things that are now new challenges for us in drought and in storm damaged forest.
I'd have to say I'm guardedly optimistic about climate change. And that optimism comes from the fact that as a society, as a ministry, and in the media, climate change has garnered a great deal of attention. 5 years ago, we wouldn't be making this video, we wouldn't be having this discussion. And now it's very encouraging to see the interest at senior levels within the ministry, at the grassroots level within the ministry, in terms of understanding climate change and thinking about how to adapt to it.
So I am optimistic around global climate change because we've accepted the fact that the climate is changing dramatically and that in certain very important ways we are influencing it and we're trying to do something about it.
Perhaps because they understand the situation better than most, the M&R scientists and resource managers who monitor and study climate change are changing their activities and their lifestyles in response to it. Their actions can inspire us as we seek our own ways to reduce our dependence on fossil fuels and lessen our ecological footprint.
I think it's important for people to understand that it's not just government that has a responsibility, but we each have a responsibility to address climate change personally, not through monumental changes, but through small actions and steps every day.
We replaced all the windows in our 1929 vintage home. We redid the insulation.
We have 8 solar panels on the back of our house.
I've replaced as many of our light bulbs as feasible with the new energy efficient bulbs.
I'm a woodlot owner. I own 2 different woodlots in Ontario, so I've planted trees.
We rebuilt our sump pumps so that instead of just dumping water back into the city water system, our sump pumps go into a pond in the backyard and we water from the pond into the gardens.
I bought all of my extended family members energy efficient light bulbs for Christmas.
I try to walk to work. I am a pretty energy efficient person in my home. I drive an energy efficient car and I drive it as little as possible.
My plan is to go down to one car next January.
Both my spouse and I, we bicycle to work every day. We both rode all winter this year for the first time ever.
Well, I own a Hummer, and both of my teenagers own Hummers, so we try to drive those every day.
We turn off lights when we leave the room. We turn off the computer when we're not using it.
I've just taken some sections of my lawn. I've decided not going to mow them anymore, and they're growing in with trees beautifully.
So we put in this year a geothermal heating unit in our house, and so half of our heat comes from that.
I unplugged the old freezer in the basement that I only use at Christmas.
The water behind me is in fact our refrigerator if we use it appropriately. And I can have fish resources within a few hundred miles of me if I'm careful and use them properly.
We all need to do whatever we can to reduce our emissions of greenhouse gases, whether it includes turning your thermostat back or driving less frequently or whatever. I think we all need to do those, and sure, I try to do that myself.
Mark Twain said that there's a great deal being said about the weather. A lot of people are talking about the weather, but not very much is being done about the weather. Well, I think this is our opportunity now to step forward and do something about the weather, particularly when it comes to climate change.